I see my colleague from South Carolina on the floor, and I ask unanimous consent to engage in colloquy the senator from South Carolina.
Without objection.
I'm sure that my colleague and friend saw the article in the Wall Street Journal this morning that says, quote, France doubts Iran ready for nuclear pact. Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius questions whether Tehran is willing to abandon the ability to build an atomic bomb. And really, in the first chapter, the first paragraph of this story is what fundamentally I would ask my colleague is really the fundamental problem. There are many issues concerning the Iranian lie, cheat for years and years about their continued progress towards the acquisition of a nuclear weapon. But I would ask my friend from South Carolina, isn't it really about the most important, let me put it this way, the most important aspect of this whole issue of these negotiations is the right to enrich. In other words, will the Iranians, haven't we already given over to them the right to continue to have the centrifuges spin and the enrichment process continue so that at some point, sooner or later, they may have only be the turn of a wrench away from a nuclear weapon?
Senator McCain, you're absolutely right. The interim deal does not dismantle the centrifuges. They're spinning as we talk. They disconnect, I say disconnect, not dismantle, some advanced centrifuges that have been installed. What people need to realize that the Iranians, over the last decade, particularly the last 3 years, have developed a very mature enrichment program, 18,000 centrifuges. They don't need 20% enriched uranium anymore with these new centrifuges to get to 90%, which would produce a uranium-based bomb. They can do it with a 3.5% stockpile. So I guess here's the basic question for us as a nation and the world at large. Do you believe the Iranians when they say they're not trying to develop a nuclear weapon, they're trying to only develop peaceful nuclear power? Do you believe them when they make that claim, given the reality of their enrichment program, they're lying, they're cheating? If their goal is to enrich, not for peaceful nuclear power purposes to make a bomb, how do you get them to change their goal? And I think what Senator McCain's pointing out is very important. The interim deal, like it or not, has legitimized enrichment in Iran. How do you go from not dismantling the plutonium reactor to complete dismantlement, shutting down and dismantling the centrifuges, and turning over the stockpile to the international community after the interim deal? How do you go from there to the end game? We're so far away from an acceptable outcome. So I just hope that people understand what the French are saying. The French are telling us that they do not believe the Iranian negotiators and the Iranian regime are serious about abandoning an enrichment program that could break out to produce a nuclear weapon. And Senator McCain, I just want to appreciate your leadership on these issues, Syria, Iran, you name it, you've been there. So I would just like to ask the question, Senator McCain, do you believe the Iranians when they say they're not trying to acquire a nuclear weapon? And from a U.S.-Israel's point of view, what would happen to our nations if they had that capability?
Could I say to my friend, one of the things that would happen right away, I think, is well known. It's not a secret that many nations in the region would then quickly acquire nuclear weapons, and maybe the wealthiest ones might even just buy one from Pakistan. That is not a secret. But could I ask my colleague this? So therefore, we now have a period of 6 months, which originally was stated as the end goal, that an agreement would be made and finalized and would be ready to be put into effect. But then we hear, well, maybe it's going to take more than 6 months. One, haven't we seen that movie before? Extended and protracted negotiations, which then the centrifuges, as the senator from South Carolina just mentioned, continue to spin. But also, wouldn't it be appropriate that for the Congress to say to the administration, and more importantly to the Iranians, that after 6 months, my friends, the screws are going to tighten? Because if you can't get an agreement in 6 months, then it would be appropriate for there to be additional pressures that would then hopefully be incentives for them to reach a final agreement rather than the status quo, which most of us believe is not satisfactory under this 6-month period. And so shouldn't there be some sanctions that would kick in after a 6-month period, which then the Iranians would know that if they don't reach an agreement, then the sanctions will be more severe? And perhaps my colleague can explain to me why the Secretary of State and the administration seems to be so opposed to us putting more pressure on the whole process to be finalized. And 6 months seems to be a reasonable length of time to get that done.
Well, the senator's right. This interim agreement has not been implemented yet. They have 6 months to reach a final agreement, but also an additional 6 months beyond that, a year basically, to drag out these negotiations. And you asked the ultimate question. Sanctions, Senator McCain, don't you believe is the only reason the Iranians are at the table? I want to compliment the administration for putting together an international regime to take the sanctions that Congress has passed over their objections, I might add, to really inflict pain on the Iranian regime, unfortunately the people too, but that's the only reason they're at the table. But here's the analysis as I understand it, Senator McCain. People in the administration believe there's a moderate element and a hardline element. And Iran is telling the United States and the P5+1, if you threaten us with any more sanctions, we walk away. We're not going to negotiate with a gun to our head. Now, these are the people who have been using a lot of guns and put a lot of guns to people's head and actually pulled the trigger, killed hundreds of soldiers in Iraq, creating chaos and mayhem in Syria. They're one of the biggest supporters of state terrorism. But that's an odd thing for them to say when I believe the only reason they're at the table to begin with is because of sanctions. So my belief is that new sanctions tied to the end game, and this is what we've been working on in a bipartisan fashion. It's just not keeping the sanctions alive for the next year. It's tying their relief to an outcome that we all want. I want a peaceful resolution of the Iranian nuclear program. If they want a peaceful nuclear power program, they can have it, just control the fuel cycle. That's been my position. If they want an enrichment capability that has to be monitored by the UN and it's robust, and the only reason they won't break out to get a nuclear weapons because of UN inspectors, that's North Korea. The movie you talked about, Senator McCain, is the movie called North Korea, where you would impose sanctions, you would relieve them, you would give them money, you would give them food, you'd reinstate sanctions, you'd have UN inspectors to control the progress. The program was never dismantled. Don't repeat the mistake in Iran that we repeated in North Korea. Dismantle this program before it's too late. So to the administration, we're trying to help, not hurt. I don't believe there's a moderate element when it comes to the Iranian nuclear program. I think that is a facade. The new president is a charming fellow on television, but he was a nuclear negotiator in 2004 and 2005 for the Iranian regime and openly bragged about how much advancement they made during his time negotiating toward an enrichment program that could produce a bomb. So this idea that there's hardliners and moderates when it comes to the Iranian nuclear program is a miscalculation. So we're working on bipartisan sanctions to continue them, and they can only be relieved when we dismantle the enrichment program. When we dismantle the plutonium reactor, heavy water reactor, it's got nothing to do with producing nuclear power for peaceful purposes, and removing the stockpile like the UN has recommended. The UN resolutions are in force today, are on the books today. This agreement is to the left of the UN. So the reason we're pushing sanctions in a bipartisan fashion is we want to avoid a conflict. The Iranian nuclear program, Senator McCain, has to be stopped one way or the other through diplomacy and sanctions or then force, unless that's the options. I cannot imagine a world with ayatollahs with nukes. It would create a nuclear arms race. You just got back from Saudi Arabia. Sunni Arab nations will want their own nuclear weapon, and you're on the road to Armageddon. Israel, my God, how could they sit on the sideline and watch a nuclear weapon be produced by people who threaten every day to wipe them off the map? So we're hoping we can produce sanctions that would enable and enhance the administration's opportunity to get a peaceful resolution. Sanctions and diplomacy end the program in a peaceful way. This is our last chance. If we get this wrong, history will judge us poorly. They are trying to get a nuclear weapon. They're hell-bent, and the only thing will stop them is pressure. And Senator McCain, I just want to ask you a question. Why are Japan banks and other business entities rushing to do business with Iran when the interim deal relieves some sanctions? Do you believe that the international community is of the mindset that the sanctions are breaking down? They're trying to jump ahead of each other to do business with Iran, and if Congress passed a new round of sanctions, it would stop that breakout? Do you think that makes sense?
Well, I think that it might. I just think that this whole perception of the United States around the world and our weakness, whether it be manifested in the Middle East with recent, I'm sure that my friend from South Carolina saw the comments of the former high-ranking member of the Saudi government. The Japanese are now starting to go their own way because of they believe American pivot is not reality. They're manifestations of this perception of American weakness all over the world. So I'm not sure they believe that we are serious here or most any place else. But I think the senator from South Carolina raises an excellent point. I seem to remember during the days of the Cold War that we used to look at the reviewing stand on the May Day parade, and we'd point out one guy and say, well, he's a moderate, and he's a softliner, and well, he's a hardliner, and you know, we hope that fill in the blank is going to really have a beneficial effect, and Russians are going to change, blah, blah, blah. And there was always this belief about hardliners and softliners. We know now from history that that was never the case. So now we look at Iran. Oh, there's the hardliners and the softliners. You know, doesn't that ignore the fundamental fact that there's one man that governs Iran and just makes all the decisions, and that guy is the Ayatollah? And now that Ahmadinejad was a hardliner, and now Rouhani is the soft, by the way, as senator from South Carolina mentioned, bragged about how he deceived the Americans when he was the negotiators and the other countries when he was the negotiator for Iran. Now he's the moderate. Now he's the good guy. So all this is just is froth. But I guess the other point that I think that really needs to be made here that we forget, in Syria and in Iran, this administration, this president, and this Secretary of State look at these countries as an arms control issue. They look at Syria as an arms control issue, while from helicopters they're dropping bombs that are killing and massacring women and children, while they are committing the most atrocious acts. On the one hand, the Secretary of State and his friend Sergei Lavrov are removing chemical weapons from Syria, while plane loads of weapons from Russia fly into Damascus and they kill people. And I'm not sure whether a mother in Syria can discriminate whether that child was killed by a chemical weapon or by a conventional weapon. So here we have the Iranians committing acts of terror all over the world, funding the sending the Iranian Revolutionary Guard into Syria, training Bashar Assad's troops in Iran and sending them back, sending in supply after supply of weapons to kill Syrians, plots to kill even the Saudi ambassador here in Washington, D.C. Yemen, they have tried to smuggle in a whole boatload full of weapons from Iran. The list goes on of their Persian ambitions throughout the Arab world and the world. But by golly, we trust them to sit down and negotiate with us seriously on the issue of nuclear weapons. This is the most narrow view of Iran than has ever happened in history. So I don't see how you can judge Iranian seriousness about really wanting to rein in and eliminate their progress towards nuclear weapon without considering their behavior throughout the world, particularly in the Middle East, which is one of aggression, terror, and outright murder of people and destabilizing the entire region to the Iranian advantage.
Well, Senator McCain, I think the point that you're making is dead on. Isn't it true, Senator McCain, that our government has designated the Iranian regime, their government, as one of the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world? We've done, is that correct?
True.
Now, here's the question. It's a good question. If you gave them if they had a nuclear weapon, are they likely to end such activity, or would they be more effective in expanding it?
Could I just interrupt, my friend? I forgot one aspect of Iranian behavior that is the most egregious: their sponsorship of Hezbollah. There's 5,000 Hezbollah from Lebanon, sponsored by Iran, that are killing Syrians as we speak at the bidding of the Ayatollah and maybe Rouhani, who's supposed to be a moderate.
You know, I think what you've just described, the litany of chaos and mayhem spread by the Iranian regime that you knew probably better than anyone because you spend so much time there, it is Hezbollah, but also Hamas. I mean, they have actually, they're all in. The people who create the biggest upheaval for Israel, they're all in for their buddy Assad, the butcher of Damascus. Without Iran's support, one of the most evil people on the planet wouldn't have a chance. Don't you believe, Senator McCain, we're in a proxy war between us and the Iranians in Syria, and that if we don't, and our actions toward we're going to use force, we're not going to use force, Assad is winning, that our policies towards Syria are affecting the regime's belief about what we may do about their nuclear program. And one thing that might reset our resolve as a nation is for the Congress to impose additional sanctions so the Ayatollahs will not be confused by our lack of will in Syria when it comes to their nuclear program. That the bottom line here is that after our debacle in Syria, don't you think we have a problem with the Iranian regime of taking us serious? The international community is now breaking the sanctions, and if new sanctions are imposed in a bipartisan way, that's the best way to reset the debate.
Well, I would also point out, if we are looking for one bright spot, I would point out that we see countries in the Gulf and the Middle East aligning with Israel in a way that we have never seen before.
Right.
And shouldn't we listen to the Prime Minister of Israel? That's the first target of Iran, the country that the Iranians said and have not renounced their commitment to, quote, wiping off the map. Do you think that maybe the relations between ourselves and Israel are at the lowest ebb? Do you think it's an accident when now Saudis and leaders of other countries are outspoken in their derision of the United States' lack of leadership in the Middle East? Isn't it interesting, finally, that the Russians, for the first time since 1973, when Anwar Sadat threw them out of Egypt, they are now major players in the Middle East?
I think the whole Mideast is going in the wrong direction at warp speed, and Congress has some obligation to speak up and do something about it and try to help the administration when we can. Number one, a new round of sanctions, if we could muster bipartisan support, would send a great message to the Iranians. We don't see you the same as we do Syria. There is a lot of confusion and differences in the body about what to do in Syria. And Senator McCain, you've been right for 3 years on this whole topic, but we are where we are. So a new round of sanctions bipartisanly passed, I think, would tell the Iranians that the American Congress and people look at you differently than the problem in Syria. I think it would also be a statement to the international community. We are resolved to get this program dismantled by using sanctions, and we're not backing off, so stop this breakout. And finally, to our friends, to the Israelis, to the Sunni Arab states, wouldn't it be welcome news to be tougher on Iran and to have the Congress reinforce the message to the Iranians that we're going to keep in place sanctions until you dismantle your program? Don't you think that would be some welcome news in a region that is absolutely desperate for some good news from America?
I think so, and I thank my colleagues for their forbearance, and I agree with the senator from South Carolina. I think it is imperative for the United States Congress and our role in the United States government that these sanctions that be enacted. The administration has plenty of time to negotiate, but we want to be prepared for failure, and there's no reason, I think, not to make those preparations. I began our conversation with the comments of the Foreign Minister of France, and that concern is shared by many of our friends and allies, both in and out of the region.